Now back to our top story, government funding of schools. And I was joined just a short time ago from our Parliament House studio by the Minister for School Education, Early Childhood and Youth, Peter Garrett. Peter Garrett, welcome to Late Line.
Thanks, Emma.
It's been 6 months since the Gonski report was handed down. How much longer will school principals need to wait before they get some kind of clarity around government funding?
We'll release final details in a few weeks, but in the meantime, Emma, I think it has been made pretty clear, and again today by the Prime Minister, that no school will lose a dollar in funding under any plan that we bring forward. In fact, all schools can expect to see funding rise, and we've identified some things in the preliminary sense which we think are pretty important for improving school performance. But obviously in a couple of weeks, people will be able to see the full detail of what we're proposing and what discussions we want to have with the states and independent education authorities.
Now, the Gonski findings come with a pretty hefty price tag. Can your government actually afford to follow through on them?
The figures that you hear bandied around are estimates, and certainly we do expect there to be additional investment, and there should be. But we want to work that through with the states in particular once we've actually made our response clear. I guess the other thing I'd say is that we have already significantly invested in education across the sectors. That's across government and non-government sectors. We've managed the economy successfully, and education sits right at the heart of Labor's agenda. So clearly we will want to be making a decision that is mindful of the budget responsibilities that we have. But we do know that if we want to see our kids lift their educational results, especially in comparison to those kids in other countries that are starting to do very well, then we'll need to work together with the states to see how we can best support them in the future.
So can I take it from what you've said then that $5 billion, which is the figure that is recommended in the Gonski report, is not going to be met by your government?
Well, look, I'm not going to get into a sort of a dollar versus dollar figure discussion with you here, Emma. It wouldn't be appropriate. I think what we need to do is recognise that we will sit down with state governments. They run the government school system, and put to them what we're proposing and discuss and negotiate with them what the quantums might be. And that's the right way for us to do it. I think it's a way that means that there's goodwill when we sit down at the negotiation table.
But $5 billion as a whole, it's likely to be less than that.
Well, again, I'm not going to go pluses and minuses with you. I appreciate you asking the question. Remember that we have doubled the funding in school education. We spent about $65 billion over a 4-year period. Big investments in things like school facilities for every school in the country. A lot of investment into the national partnerships, where we've been focusing on things like literacy and numeracy and teacher quality. So we've got the runs on the board as a government when it comes to investing in education, but I'm not going to second guess a figure until such time as we make our plan public and also sit down with the states and start negotiation.
As you mentioned, you've doubled the amount that's been spent on education, that is your government, but there hasn't been any commensurate lift in standards. The Prime Minister today said that the aim at the heart of your response to Gonski will be lifting standards. How do you do that? How do you guarantee that, given your funding increases so far haven't managed to achieve that?
Oh, I don't think that's true. I think we're starting to see some signs of improvement in educational outcomes from students. We've got about 70% or so of the schools that were involved in the national partnership investment seeing improvements in literacy. Over that, seeing improvements in numeracy, I think in Year 5 in particular. And I've got to say that in all of the schools that I visit, where I'm looking at how schools have applied the resources that they've received through this very big investment in ours, I'm seeing teachers and students really blossoming in the classroom. Now, over time, it takes some time for some of this investment to wash through the system. And it's also the case that we expected to learn from those investments. And one thing I can tell you is that if we're seeing that percentage of schools show improvements on that scale, then I think we can say there's signs that the investment definitely is working, but we'll still need to see the figures over the years to come to get a fuller idea. In the meantime, Gonski's findings were pretty straightforward, Emma. A decline in educational performance and a big gap between kids in our low SES schools and those in other schools, and they need to be addressed.
So, leaked modelling that was sent by the Education Department to schools giving some indication of how the changes would affect them shows that as many as 3,000 schools would lose money under the Gonski proposals.
That is not the government's modelling, and the figures are not correct at all. No school will lose a single dollar, and that commitment is absolute. What people saw out of those figures was modelling from the Gonski panel. It's not the government's figures, and I can't stress that clearly or strongly enough. We are absolutely committed, and by the way, it's one reason why this has been a reasonably lengthy process. We've been working through all of the details in the findings of Mr Gonski. Not only did his panel identify a schooling resource standard that they thought should apply to all kids in all schools, but also a series of loadings that also should be applied around areas of indigeneity or remoteness or English language proficiency, and they also proposed a series of measurements for those loadings. Now, all of that work has had to be worked through. Those modelling figures that we saw on the weekend in the newspapers were not correct and do not reflect in any way what we will be putting as a final decision on the Gonski panel review.
But they were correct insofar as how the Gonski report saw things should be changed, insofar as that panel believed that to increase equity, you needed to actually raise the standards of the more disadvantaged schools, the government schools, relative to those in the non-government sector.
Yeah, and I think that insight was correct. But the thing about the modelling that you're referring to is that it was based on the information that the Gonski panel had in front of it. It didn't have all the information that governments have at their disposal. And in fact, as we work through our modelling, we're looking at those very things to see whether there are anomalies or losing schools that come through in the modelling processes underway, because we've always said that no school will lose a single dollar. And the Prime Minister again today, every school will see funding increase under any new model.
Is that in real terms?
Yes, that's correct, in real terms.
So all funding will increase from what they currently receive. It will be indexed from what they currently receive, so it will be more than what they currently receive.
We've always said that indexation will be part of any future model, and increases in funding for all schools will be a part of any future model. I can't be much clearer than that. So
funding to non-government schools will also continue to be indexed on an annual basis?
That's right. There's indexation that applies at the moment, and I think the key thing about this debate, which has got a bit lost in what we saw over the weekend, is that the Gonski panel's recommendation is that we should have a common funding model for all students in all schools. Now, today it's been incorrectly reported that we've been saying that there should be the same funding that applies to government and non-government schools. That's not true. It's about the same funding model applying to students in each of those schools. Obviously, the funding's going to be different. Kids in a remote school in, Western New South Wales with indigeneity, with English language issues, with low socioeconomic backgrounds, clearly they already receive funding through state government systems and sometimes Commonwealth programs. Any funding model must reflect both the situation that students face in terms of reaching their education potential, and also part of the principles that we already have underway in funding that have applied for quite a considerable period of time from a Commonwealth perspective.
At the moment, the funding breakup is roughly 30% to non-government schools and 70% to government schools. Will that general split generally still apply, or do you expect that one might become higher than the other?
Well, again, it's one of those quantum questions, and you're absolutely right to ask it, but the appropriate place for us to answer it is when we actually deliver our final response and when we begin the process of talking through with the states and also the independent schools how we see a model working.
Will the new money that you intend to provide to schools, will it start to flow before the next federal election?
Well, we've got a series of commitments that exist in school funding under legislation in the Parliament, and we want to provide funding certainty for non-government schools, and we'll certainly do that. and as well as that provide the certainty that's necessary for states to continue to deliver their funding. My intention is that we do introduce legislation into the Parliament by the end of this year, but I can absolutely stress to you that we will provide funding certainty. We've already done that, by the way. We already extended the funding model for the non-government school sector. I think they were appreciative of that, and we'll provide funding certainty as we go forward.
That's just the status quo, though. What I'm asking you, though, is it possible then that any promises you'll make might never need to be followed through because a federal election will intervene?
Well, I've been saying that I'm not going to speculate about a couple of things about the final delivery of our response to Gonski. I'm certainly going to say to you that we want to go up to that federal election, contest it and prevail. But what we're saying now isn't based on whether or not we go to an election at a certain time. It's based on our commitment to deliver on what we said we'd do when we commissioned the report, when the Prime Minister commissioned that report. And that is, look at whether we can fund schools in a way that is transparent, effective, fair, and delivers better education results for our kids across all sectors. Now, that's the main game in education for us, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on.
Now, in her speech today, the Prime Minister said, and I'm quoting, "I've never looked at a big independent school in an established suburb and thought that's not fair." Do you feel the same way?
Look, I went to one of those schools, Emma. I'm a product of both systems. The primary school I went to was a government school, a fantastic school, and the secondary school that I went to was a non-government school, and I thought it educated people pretty well. No, I don't look at schools in that way. I understand, for example, when I go to a school in an area, say, for example, that's in peri-urban Sydney or peri-urban Melbourne, that it's a new school community, that their P&C has only just started operating, that they're existing on a greenfield site, and they may not have a tennis court to their name. And I know when I go past some of the schools that you're referring to that they've been in existence for 30, 40, 50, maybe even longer years, and they've built up sometimes and accumulated the funds through fundraising and other mechanisms to get those resources. I really think that the days of us looking at the systems against one another ought to be over. I think it was highly regrettable for the Leader of the Opposition to make the comments he made this morning about the injustices in funding government schools. I think that's an extraordinary observation for the opposition leader to make. Unfortunately, he got ejected from the Parliament, so we didn't get to hear too much from him this afternoon either. But the point is this. When we invested money, say, for example, on supporting students with disabilities, we did it into each system, government and non-government. We recognise that there are students who are in those non-government school systems. They have a citizenship entitlement to be supported to some extent by government, not necessarily to the full extent as students in government schools rightly recognise and have.
But can you understand how some people might look at a school with perhaps a rifle range, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a school that sends its students business class on study trips overseas, how some people might think it's unfair that school receives millions of dollars from the taxpayer while a government school in a neighbouring suburb can't even afford some of the basics?
Well, I think the key thing about your question is that we've provided high levels of investment into government schools. We've provided a lot of investment, low SES schools, teacher quality, literacy and numeracy. And I don't see, when I look at two schools, whether or not they've got 2 extra tennis courts or not. I mean, I understand that high fee-paying schools quite often have facilities of the kind that you mentioned, and schools in lower socio-economic areas don't have them. But we fully support government schools significantly, as do state governments, and we're not going to buy into a debate around looking over someone's fence to see whether they've got an extra tennis court or a swimming pool. We want to focus on making sure that in all schools, the investments that we apply are directed to the things that we know make a difference and work for the kids in the school. That's teacher quality, that's making sure there's transparency, it's picking up on the things that have worked in other school education settings. And I think that's a debate that we kind of need to have as a country. How do we actually lift our education performance? Because it means we lift our economic performance as well.
OK, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Emma.